Good afternoon, everybody. I am Grazia Mannozzi, Director of the Center for Restorative Justice and Mediation Studies. And I'm here with Professor João Salma. I'm very happy. It's really like a dream. First, I would like to express a special thanks to our distinguished speakers of today, Professor George Pavlich from Canada and Tadia Hermina Roncada from Brazil. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth lecture in our 10 years, 10 lecture series, which is devoted to the Americas. As you all might expect, this program unites leading voices, renowned scholars, seasoned experts, and skilled practitioners to offer their perspective. And together, we will explore the progression and the present-day challenges of restorative justice from a truly global perspective. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Professor Pavlich. It's a great pleasure to introduce our guest. Professor Pavlich is a Tory Chair at the University of Alberta. I have had the privilege of meeting Professor Pavlich several times and at various international conferences on restorative justice. And I can say that each time I've been deeply impressed by the profound depth of his thought and his exceptional expertise. His writings are fundamental for the scientific community, the academic community, offering invaluable insight into the intersection of law, society, and justice. His research spans several interdisciplinary fields, including critical criminology, sociology of law, restorative justice, and social theory. Professor Pavlich has made significant contribution to the understanding the process of accusation and criminalization, the dynamics of governance and social regulation, and challenges of restorative justice in contemporary context. He's the author of key works such as Justice Fragmented, Governing Paradoxes of Restorative Justice. I have the book right here in my library.
My favorite.
It's my favorite, yes. And the Thresholds of Accusation and other books on restorative justice, indigenous justice, accusation in Canada. His writings reflect a deep ability to connect theoretical insights and practical issues, offering valuable tools for understanding law and society today. We are honored to have you with us. Our second speaker is Katia Roncada, which is also a dear friend, assistant judge of the presidency of the National Council of Justice. Katia Roncada is also federal judge in São Paulo since 2002, specialist in civil procedural law. She is a master student in restorative justice at Eastern Mennonite University and member of the Restorative Justice Management Committee of the National Council of Justice. She is also circular process facilitator, trainer, and tutor. We had the privilege of being part of the same group. Do you remember, Katia, trained in restorative justice by Phil and Aaron Gattenspy? And we also met last February in Honolulu at the International Summit on Justice Innovation. Her extensive expertise and experience will be invaluable in exploring the issues and challenges of restorative justice, particularly from the perspective of the judiciary. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And last but certainly not least, I'm happy and delighted to welcome Professor João Salma, who has just arrived from the USA. Many students knows Professor Salm because he has been guest. He came several times to the University of Insubria, and last year we made a sort of experiment with American students, Italian students in the same class, and it was very, very nice. Thank you, Joao, for joining us. It's always a great pleasure to have you here. So we are ready to start with the first speaker, and Professor Pavlic, the floor now is yours. We are eager to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. It almost makes me think like Socrates, I don't recognize myself in them, but thank you very much for them. They're very kind. I'd like to thank Grazia. We've met on several occasions, and each time it's been a great privilege for me too. And thank you for inviting me to speak on the anniversary of the center, the 10th anniversary of the Center for Restorative Justice and Mediation Studies. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this all together, and especially to my long-standing friend Joao Salm for suggesting me as a potential speaker. And I'm delighted to share the podium with Katia, and as I said, looking forward to your paper. I want also to start by acknowledging that I'm addressing you from Treaty 6 territory, and respectfully acknowledge the privilege of doing so from the homeland of several First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose presence continues to enrich a very vibrant community. So let me start now on what is going to be a largely speculative analysis of what I think is the future of restorative justice, or could be the future, let me say. As is well known, early restorative justice advocates called for a paradigm shift to respond to relational violations, social harm, in new ways. For example, Howard Zerr called upon us to change our lenses completely. So really change them, to imagine justice outside of alienating, adversarial, vengeful, criminalizing paradigms. The aim then was to revolutionize how we approached wrongdoing, turning away from the state's focus on crime, individual criminals, culpability, and punishment. In its early days, community mediation pursued justice within and for communities, seeking grassroots responses to conflict while aiming to restore right relations and strengthen participatory democracies. Perhaps how Raymond Schonholz gives us a very good insight into that. The aims and promises were gradually weakened as restorative justice movements increasingly saw themselves as complementary alternatives to state law. Caught in the grip of new hegemonies and tethered to state criminalization, restorative programs found themselves increasingly ensnared by what I've elsewhere called, and which was mentioned earlier, governing paradoxes. Here, restorative advocates claim to challenge criminal justice, but ended up accepting state definitions of crime rather than, say, social harm. They accepted state definitions of individual criminals rather than focusing specifically on relations. They also accepted other concepts in the idiom of criminalization, victims, punishment, and the like. But today I want to ask myself and ourselves here, is it possible that the future of restorative justice might again refuse to be part of subaltern connections to criminalizing state fields? Could it liberate itself therefrom, and what would that mean? In arguing yes, I plan to tackle 3 lines of thinking. First, I'd like to return to the movement's past aspirations and rekindle attachments to its call for a paradigm shift in justice. Looking to the recent successes of indigenous law, legal pluralism, and the sociology of law, one might consider restorative justice not as an alternative to state criminal law, but rather it might be understood as a kind of law in its own right. Secondly, if cast as such a law, future restorative justice programs, powers and practices will engage new problems and puzzles. For example, rather than focusing on state-defined individual criminals and victims, restorative law might focus and emphasize harmful collective relations. This immediately raises an issue that requires further thought, and this is my third point. Like all forms of law, we must answer a very basic question. What restraints will check or temper the arbitrary powers of that law's, or sorry, the arbitrary exercise of that law's powers? So let me turn to the first of these. In future, restorative justice may take seriously selective insights from indigenous legal scholars, legal pluralism, and the sociology of law. These discourses all noted that while the state claimed an exclusive authority to define legitimate law, it also rejected the existence of all other laws. Often, the latter, however, had much more consequences for people and for many more people. In colonial contexts, for example, state authorities mostly did not recognize indigenous law. That political ploy was founded on settler colonial myths about state law and bold attempts to delegitimize rival legal fields. But as Val Napoleon and John Burroughs point out, indigenous law's resurging ethics, sources, processes, and storied attachments to the land indicate that the colonial state's assertion of unbridled dominance was a passing historical artifice. Napoleon and Friedman even stressed that indigenous laws for centuries had previously and subsequently deliberated on messy social conditions, and they did so in the absence of any even reference to state law. In conceptually allied ways, many thinkers like Merry, Schiff-Berman, Griffiths, Tamana, and others have highlighted that legitimate law is never the exclusive domain of centralized states. Indeed, a burgeoning field of legal pluralism that is now almost ubiquitous has a core credo, and that is that state law is never the only source of law. Merry, for example, and this was in 1988 already, challenged the idea and the predisposition, as she called it, to think of all ordering as, in her terms, rooted in state law. These legal pluralists highlighted how multiple forms of law variously make up complex legal landscapes, and together they regulate our societies. Similarly, sociologists of law like Eugen Ehrlich considered customary living law as far more immediate than abstract jurisprudential or sovereign powers. From this vantage, central colonial and modern state law was always underpinned by more basic customary laws. Equally, George Gervich, writing during and after the Second World War, even borrowed from jurists to insist that where there is society, there is law. So where there is society, there is law. His terms quoting Roman jurists. The author focused on social relations where collective values came into conflict. Different social laws resolved value conflicts in different ways, promising to realize, to make manifest local promises and ideas of justice. State law is merely one example, and not a terribly good example, of how law might operate. Drawing on these discourses, I want to say that states have regulated restorative justice to the realms, restorative justice to the realms of informal dispute resolution. The state does not usually posit it as real or proper law. So if legal pluralists are right, we may say that a de facto legal pluralism is denied by state claims to represent a singular and only real law. Unsurprisingly, facing such concepts and contexts, restorative justice programs tempered earlier bids to challenge state justice paradigms. Instead, many turned to criminal justice institutions to authorize, fund, and populate their operations. But if we take legal pluralism seriously, restorative justice is not really an alternative to law. Rather, and this is something that I want to just suggest speculatively, the altered lenses of a new legal paradigm might bring something completely different into focus. It might see restorative justice as law. Let me repeat this. Restorative justice then should not be seen as a complement to state criminal law. Rather, it is in and of itself a law in its own right. To be sure, restorative justice legal fields may have degrees of autonomy, even as they stand in relation to other legal fields. However, the relative autonomy of a restorative legality might rekindle the aspirations of the early thinkers to offer a justice paradigm shift, thereby turning away from short-term and untenable attempts to serve state law as a complementary alternative. In short, following the lead of indigenous law scholars, legal pluralists, and the sociology of law, one might reimagine restorative justice as a basic kind of social law directed to relations problematized as social harm or wrongdoing. That relational emphasis spells the outlines of a new paradigm directed to intersecting individual and collective responsibilities for social wrongdoing and harm. In other words, we are here dealing with a type of law focused on changing problematic relations. Its aim is to secure just social limits by resolving collective value conflicts and recognizing both social and individual responsibilities. So it extends quite significantly beyond the language of crime and punishment. So let me now turn to my second point, and we might say, all well and good, but how exactly might restorative justice be considered law in this sense? What ideas and powers would surface as this new paradigm of justice, or in this new paradigm of justice? For Gervich, we may say that social law follows on the heels of troubled relational experiences, where fraught relations and collective value conflicts surface. Restorative law would surely challenge state law's notions of crimes, criminals, retributive vengeance, and even punishment. It would actively pursue relational responsibilities for situations where shared values fracture. It would thus stage arenas, performances, and powers, such as community panels and circles in new guises, that name, accuse, and do something about relational structures that generate harm. This is not such a new concept in a way, because as Napoleon helps us think, law is always messy and it is always a complex enterprise. She says, and I quote, "It is law that enables large groups of people to collectively manage themselves." And quoting Weber, she says, "against a backdrop of deep-seated normative disagreement." I've called them collective value conflicts. And she continues, "to fashion collective positions out of the welter of disagreement. Law is not a thing. It is a process that people actually engage in. They become part of the deliberative process, and we can learn that from indigenous law." Thinking about the prospects for restorative justice, for restorative law, invites us then to rethink our current practices. Specifically, it invites a discussion of what sort of power these legal fields ought to deploy. The practical question is this: how might techniques that today promise a specifically restorative justice, say circles, conferences, panels, be modified, updated as legal actors that deal with both collective and individual responsibilities following social doing? I admit this is a completely overwhelming task, even to contemplate. However, we might look to Lon Fuller to start with the idea that all legal fields are shaped by local grassroots power, what he calls communal enterprises. And he actually refers to them as crafts, like law as a craft, like glass blowing, for example. And he further says that to sit as valid law, as a good craft, governors must adhere to a basic inner morality of how they subject human conduct to the governance of rules. Those are his words. Opposed to restorative law leads us to a set of different ideas. It takes us directly to a recognition that legal fields always exercise power in subjecting people to governance. And those various forms of power, I've called them sovereignty, disciplinary, and biopolitical, following Foucault, but one can think of other ways of thinking about that. But anyway, they intersect within and across fields. And as I see it, while powers of state criminal law cannot be ignored at current historical moments, counter-hegemonic quests to think about and find new paradigms of justice demand that we reformulate what we are able to think of and see as law. With an admittedly uncomfortable degree of speculation, one could reimagine restorative law practically, referring to a hypothetical case of a poverty-stricken person who takes a loaf of bread to feed their starving children. The state's criminal law demands that we first detect a criminal act. Then we search technically for a culpable individual who can be legally punished. By contrast, restorative law might seek to realize a completely different idea of justice. Restorative law might take account of and focus attention on complex social relations that set the stage for collective conflicts. The point here is made by referring to a well-known allegory that Stan Cohen many decades ago referred to as a Ugandan oracle. We have this idea of bodies floating down the river. We all know this, I think, where someone goes in, pulls out the bodies from the water and eventually gets exhausted and then starts to wonder, do I keep pulling out bodies here at the lower level, or do I go upstream to figure out what are the causes of these people coming down the river? Now, he says, so we might say restorative law's powers are likely to look upstream, emphasizing that restorative law considered in the future are likely to look upstream much more so than they do today, emphasizing the need to change harm-producing social structures, say unequal class, gender, or race marginalization, the very structures that produce conditions for someone taking food in order for their family to survive. To merely open such discussions, let me say two things about the kinds of restorative powers that might attend to future restorative legal fields. First, initial moments that categorize collective value conflicts should be seen as moments of translation, where social L-O-R-E, law, is translated into ideas of L-A-W in an attempt to render justice manifest in context. Think of state criminal law. Here, our criminal accusations initiate an individual's criminalizing journeys through institutions of criminal justice. But criminal accusation of individuals certainly doesn't exhaust what accusation could be. For example, restorative accusations might reimagine what we mean by way of categorizing processes, what we see as the problem. We could see it as accusation could then be seen as scripted performances staged to categorize and then deal with dislocated collective relations. Returning to our example, restorative practices, town halls, panels, circles, new legal techniques, might then consider who, what, and how to accuse, to best categorize, to best deal with, to name the social harms at play. Secondly, the example might imply individual responsibilities to the store owner. These are individual responsibilities, but far more significant are the unequal social structures responsible for disruptions of the sort. Performative accusations might then bring into focus new kinds of legal collective persons, say the social structures responsible for economic marginalization. In turn, these new persons, these new structural persons, could be targeted by legal powers designed to name and change them. What kind of legal person, practices, and powers could accompany such accusation? Of course, this is a question for much future discussion. However, just as state accusations may open to individual criminalizing trials, so accusations of social structures may open to new laws whose remit is to name and change society's problems and to avoid future relational harms. The point would be to locate, name, transform upstream collective structures that reproduce destructive local events. I'm thinking here of vast inequalities in income, massive unequal marginalization, racism, intersectionality, patriarchies. Of course, there are no certainties here, no guarantees that any powers of restorative law will not perversely unleash arbitrary powers. And this leads to my last point. What rule of law restraints might check restorative law? We have to rethink the very idea of what restraints on law might be approached if we are thinking about a new kind of law. Since we have only sketched very thin ideas for a future restorative legal field, I cannot offer much detail on how to restrain them. Val Napoleon has done this quite well in indigenous law contexts. But this should not take away from the my inability to say that it's difficult to say what to restrain, because we haven't really framed exactly what it is that restorative law would look like. But it is crucial to say that any deliberation of law should always be accompanied by by talk about which mechanisms will curb indiscriminate exercises of legal power. The use of arbitrary force is constantly to be appraised and restrained. The point is this: power works not through works through both productive and coercive relations, and it is neither good nor bad. Martin Krieger puts it nicely. Wild power, he tells us, is a terrible thing. Whether that is a despotic power or anarchic, or many points in between. Societies that value the rule of law seek always to tame and moderate its exercise, among them legal ways. And so restorative legal fields, like other forms of law, must seek to, in his terms, temper the powers that they deploy. The matter of holding any law morally and not simply technically to account is an endless task of openness, critique, vigilance, and accountability. So in sum, as I've hoped to have shown, conceptualizing institutionalizing restorative justice as law is to speculate on possible futures for the movement. If new restorative legal powers are to be invested in social fields that conceptualize social harms, as well as individual and collective responsibilities, we will need to govern social conflicts through new paradigms. And yet, no legal power is immune from the possibility of its arbitrary exercise. A key discussion must settle on how to temper restorative powers in legally plural social contexts. So I admit, addressing the future of restorative laws in this way may seem like an absolutely impossible endeavor. It is. And yet it is only by working through perceived impossibilities now that justice may appear in social contexts that are yet to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pavlich, for this thought-provoking presentation on restorative justice as an alternative or as a complement or something else in the context of pluralism, which is very, very interesting, especially from the perspective of civil law countries, because at least for us, making a legislation on restorative justice is of fundamental importance, but at the same time, it may create probably more problems than they want to resolve. But now we have an exceptional discussion for this lecture. So Joao, I give you the floor.
Thank you, George, for an enlightening presentation. In the field of restorative justice, it seems like we lack in my view, my point of view, we lack the need for contextualization. When we speak of restorative justice in a plural, multi-centric society where contexts range from economic spaces, isonomies, and anomic spaces, it seems to me that these contexts sort of allow these ideas that you're putting forward, RJ, restorative justice as law, might take different connotation, if I'm using the word correctly. When we contextualize RJ as the law in terms of within a structure that is driven by a strong, fierce, hierarchical structure, that may be very different from one that is not such. So my question to you, George, I don't know if what I'm rambling here makes sense to you, but how would you conceive this RJ restorative justice as the law in spaces, bringing in these different perspectives, indigenous, collective movements, and different group arrangements? How do you see that happening in such a complexity, rather than one size fits all and sort of framework. Does that make sense, George? Am I just
It
rambling here?
does. No, that's that, and it dovetails with the idea of, listen, Grazia's point about civil law versus common law. You know, maybe that this idea of thinking about restorative justice as law might resonate in a common law system, but not in a civil law system with its hierarchies and so on. You know, it's one way of thinking about it. So let me just say that what I'm trying to do is to challenge what is considered law in both civil and common law contexts. I think indigenous legal scholars have taught us that law is something that resides within all of our communities, and it is something that often affects us much more locally than the abstractions that state law has claimed. It's time to reclaim that concept of law. So in other words, this is not to say restorative justice should become a law like the state's law. On the contrary, a new paradigm of justice that takes seriously legal pluralism recognizes that that context requires a completely different way of conceptualizing law. And it's neither common law nor the choice is not common law or civil law, but common law and civil law versus other kinds of law that are actually could be much more significant. The resurgence of indigenous law, it gives us a good example of how this can actually happen. So indigenous law around the world is now very much part of what were previously colonial forms. So let's take and you know, one way of thinking about it, Burroughs and others have noted this, is to think about confederations, which make it possible for different legal fields to operate within a structure. So, you know, in Canada, the federation could be expanded, and it is being expanded. We currently have Aboriginal, for example, is what is called in the law, Aboriginal rights, property rights. There are all sorts of things that are happening, Indigenous police forces, Indigenous processes that claim to offer Indigenous law, legal approaches to particular kinds of deliberations. Let's look at it. This is not only in Canada. If you look at South Africa, there are customary laws which decide, for example, it is recognized in their constitution that customary law should be understood as a law, just a law which is equivalent to common law, the Roman Dutch laws. So in other words, and all of these laws need to follow the constitutional principles. So if any of them violate the constitutional principles, they are ipso facto not law. And so we've seen a situation where you have tribal customary courts, customary elders, and political structures, customary forms of dispute resolution, which are now recognized as law. And what is the advantage of that? It challenges the basis of common law and criminal law and allows for these voices to speak a different idea or speak different ideas of justice and to seek to realize them in different ways. And I'm suggesting that in the context of Western, maybe legal frameworks, whether it be civil or common law, maybe restorative justice could be seen as a kind of law that names structural and individual responsibilities and tries to seek ways of changing them at an through upstream models. And that's something that is still to be developed, but it is something that's quite different. It really speaks back to the promises, the early promises of restorative advocates, and tries to follow through on the promises of what the aspirations that they had. It doesn't then subjugate itself to a legal system and become part of that as a complementary alternative. And that's what I'm trying to get at. I hope I'm, it's kind of new and it's different to even think about what's at stake here. But I think there's enough now in Indigenous law, legal pluralism, and the sociology of law to begin thinking about this in new ways.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask. I'm thinking here. So would that entail then that it is not only conceiving, indigenous ways of approaching justice and other ways of approaching justice as law? Would that entail that the context then needs to sort of be also reimagined? Is it because in my mind, the state law can be conceived within the framework of formal organizations, bureaucracies. The question then would be, and it's very much based off of codification, written codes, and so forth. Would that mean that, we need to rethink our spaces, our contexts, to sort of be adequate to this new perception of RJ as also the law, or the law, period?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So
it's
not only about rethinking the law, but also reimagining the context and the structures, the organizational, to go beyond the instrumental formal rationality that is sort of sustaining the state form of law, right? How do we go beyond that and rethink not only the law, but the structures, the organizational structures, to bringing the more value-based as opposed to instrumental rational, reasoning? Does that make sense, George?
It does, and the way I would, what I would put, I think that's a very astute question. I mean, I think the question is, listen, we're in a political environment now that maybe this becomes really difficult to even imagine. But that is precisely what a paradigm shift is about. You literally can't see the issues because you're immersed in a previous paradigm. And a paradigm shift involves the idea of beginning to think differently about these things. And I think the moment is right, certainly in Canada, for that to happen. And you've got a Supreme Court justice, the head of the Supreme Court, our senior court, saying, we're still locked in paradigms of the 19th century and we need to start updating how we think about justice, how we think. When you have that level happening, you know that the political ethos is correct. I know a lot of Alberta judges have actually, especially retired ones, have said, listen, if you want to continue spending billions and you wanting to subordinate people and you want to create new and more prisons, and call that justice, then continue in exactly the same way as you're going right now. But if you want to do something about it, we need to think completely different. This is a retired judge who articulates this. So I think the moment has arrived, and with the resurgence of Indigenous law in Canada, for example, the moment is such that the question now becomes, how do you allow legal pluralism to exist, and how do you allow autonomy at local levels, but without enabling perverse calculations of justice that go against a broader order? So what kind of constitutional protections are required? These are matters that will have to be worked out. But they're not impossible, because at the moment we have a constitution and we have many different provinces and municipalities, all of which make particular kinds of law. If you expand that and you have a different definition of law. And you know, the definition is not that significant. If you look at the sources of indigenous law as described by Burroughs and Napoleon, it is very, it's allegorically related to the ways that common law, for example, might have existed, but it just doesn't have that bureaucratic hierarchy, and it's not abstracted. It's located on the land, and it's recognized that law is a deliberation for this collective and for those of us who are part of this collective. And when something goes wrong, it's a matter of not only individual responsibility, but also responsibility of how did we get here? How, as we as a collective, what are the responsibilities for us? For example, if we have a situation where someone is stealing bread to feed their hungry family because they're too poor to afford anything else, we have an issue there. And the issue is not simply an individual matter, it's a matter of how did we as a society produce the conditions within which that becomes possible. And that's what I'm trying to get at. And I think conceptualizing what you do about that as law has some validity. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Pavlich, for this answer.
Thank you.
I add, Joao, just a short consideration from the Italian, but I should say from the European perspective, because hearing you is very, very interesting. And I feel that the issue of legal pluralism is much more important in those countries where there are strong indigenous components of the population, and where the issue of relationship among different groups is really important. But if I observe restorative justice from the Italian and European perspective, I feel that we can't properly speak about legal pluralism because we don't have indigenous group. I mean, in Italy, Italians are the indigenous. We have a problem of immigration, which is a totally different issue. So I think that indigenous justice and indigenous law provoke a reflection on the sources of law, the link between the law and the population, because those laws are really, the indigenous law belong to people. They are not properly imposed from the top, but they belong to people. So if I see restorative justice from the European perspective, I see restorative justice only as a method. It doesn't pose a problem of pluralism, because restorative justice is always linked to the legal definition of conflicts. So restorative justice offers only a method to solve conflicts, to approach conflicts. But it's not a matter of legal pluralism. And the proof is that from the civil law country perspective, we try to how can I say, internalize restorative justice and make a legal, strict discipline of restorative justice as another form of state law. And I'm afraid that Italian legislation on restorative justice, which is of course more important, well done, and so on, it may kills the spirit of restorative justice. Because it doesn't offer the idea of legal pluralism. It's only a method that we use when we have big conflicts, severe crimes, and so on. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But you did bring up a very interesting point. It sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, but within the Italian context, pluralism is not so RJ becomes more of this method, this approach to solving conflict that can be co-opted by the state apparatus through legislation. But let's take, for example, the issue of crimmigration, right? The criminalization of immigration, right? How can you conceive that pluralistic approach to conceiving RJ as the law if those immigrants that are being already a priori conceived as criminals because they are in not their lands not legally, how do you include their voices as part of a process of solving the issue or the supposedly harm that they're creating within by breaching that limit of so it's interesting because the world has become so diverse and so plural and so, the word I like to say, multidimensional, but it doesn't really, I think what George was talking about in terms of like looking at the law of centuries ago, or the Supreme Court judge that he mentioned earlier, that conception doesn't really speak to the needs and the issues that we have at hand. And how do you look at restorative justice as the law in issues like crimmigration or what's the term, the criminalization of environmental crime, the ecocide. Yeah, there's an ecocide, right? How do you see RJ being the law in addressing those issues that are just overwhelming right now, right? Especially with the political rollout in the Americas. I know Canada is struggling with issues of immigration. There's a lot of resistance there. Obviously, the United States and Brazil has its own issues regarding immigrants and issues of environmental harm. So, George, I'm just going to throw that all to you.
Okay. Well, let me just go back to your point about, I actually don't think that legal pluralism is absent from Europe. I think it's the place par excellence. If you just look at the EU and the way that legal systems are bound together. And yes, I agree with you, it is coming down. So there's a degree of legal pluralism that exists at that level. But even within the systems of legal pluralism, this is a way of giving voice to the ideas and the concepts that people at a local level might be experiencing and not able to articulate through legal systems that claim to be absolute. That's the point. The point is that this law is not absolute. It's our law. And to the extent that we regard it as legitimate, we will obey it. But to the extent that we don't regard it as legitimate, maybe then we need to start finding areas which is where people tend to transgress the law. And this is sometimes they do it for other reasons, but sometimes it is about legitimacy issues. And it becomes a very complex matter, not one that I'm prepared to say I can resolve, but I can say that this is exactly why calling for restorative law is precisely not to allow restorative justice to be subjugated by an abstracted law that works off a paradigm that really runs counter to the founding promises of the movement. It doesn't always do that. I'm not saying that all states, and as you say, Italy may well have very interesting ways of incorporating restorative justice, as does Brazil, as does Canada. You know, but the point is there needs to be, and this is where I'm trying to say that where it is that for the most part law subjugates or places restorative justice in a position that it is beholden and open to the co-optations, that's where you need to have a conception of restorative justice that secures what makes it different from the system. Otherwise, it might as well just collapse into the system. And one of the points that I'm trying to make is that seeing restorative justice as law can be very helpful. One last point, you know, on the matter that supports my idea about the legal person, changing the legal person. Think about New Zealand, where rivers or mountains have been made legal persons so that Māori can protect those areas, and ascribing rights, duties, obligations to a river or to a sacred river or a sacred mountain can allow a different approach to that. It doesn't have to be a conflicted individual culpability. You either transgress the law or not. It rather talks about the obligations that are required of everybody who uses that mountain. And that mountain itself has certain rights and so on. And that allows for a different discussion, a different politics to emerge around that law. And so that, you know, all I'm saying is, I think that what I'm saying is, I have no suggestion that this is the most necessary thing, that you know, seeing restorative justice at law, but it has potential for the future because it allows you to recalibrate what we understand by law, to reclaim it, just as Schonholz and others try to reclaim it for communities and to place it within participatory democracies rather than abstractions, as it were. And that's what I'm really trying, the instinct that lies behind what I'm doing.
Thank you, George. I totally agree with you. And I also think that at least for Italy, the way to see restorative justice as a paradigm in the terms you said is a long way, because we have moved only few steps forward, and we are still at the phase in which restorative justice is a part of our legislation without provoking a shifting of the paradigm, of the approach, of the dialogue inside the country and with the other European countries. So it's a long way to have this cultural change. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you. Joe, I think it's time to give the floor to Katia Roncada. Katia Roncada will speak about restorative justice in Brazil, a transformative purposes with judiciary system. Katia, we give you the floor.
Are you share again? Is it working or no? Yes?
Not now. Could you try again? Please.
What's happening?
Did you make her the host?
No, I tried before. Let's see.
Okay.
And now? Okay.
Now, perfect, perfect. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning again. I'd like to thank Professor Grazia Manozzi for the invitation and say I'm very honored to this opportunity. I'd like to greet Professor João Salme, who is very important in my career, and to greet Professor George Pavlich, congratulating him on his talk Your lecture leaves many reflections. Makes a lot of sense for me. But let me try show my ideas now. It's a great pleasure. I'm not seeing anyone. I don't know why, but I will try to speak without seeing.
When you present, Katia, you can't see the people, but we see you perfectly and we hear you perfectly.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
You can see her PowerPoint.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, to have this opportunity to share with you restorative justice in Brazil and a little what has been done. I really trust what we have been doing. And let me show you, this is CNJ. As Grazia said, I am a federal judge. I've been working in CNJ in the first moment. I have been part of CNJ Restorative Justice Committee since 2020. And since September 2023, I have been working as the assistant judge to the Chief Justice of Brazil on restorative justice matters. And let me show you about, it's important to say that the connection between judiciary and restorative justice in Brazil to show what's happening. So the role of Brazilian National Council of Justice. The National Council of Justice is a body of Brazil's judiciary established by Constitutional Amendment 45 in 2004. Inaugurated in 2005 in Brasilia, CNJ operates throughout the territory, the national territory. It oversees the administrative and financial control of Brazil's judiciary system, excluding the Federal Supreme Court, the highest judicial court. And CNJ also has been developing important judicial policies. See, CNJ is a Brazilian creation. We only can see something like this in Brazil. And this is the structure, Brazilian judiciary power, where you can see in the top the Federal Supreme Court and right below the National Council of Justice, where you can see this red arrow. My goal with this slide is to show where CNJ is in the structure. And CNJ, just a minute. CNJ Restorative Justice Committee was formed in CNJ elected restorative justice as one of its priorities and formed a committee in order to address this matter. CNJ created the Resolution 225 from 2016 policy which enabled judges to work with the community, academia, and other institutions to implement restorative justice. This policy had a significant effect in encouraging our other judges to learn and create RJ programs. It's important to remember that restorative justice history is strongly connected to judiciary, not as a part of it, but as a democratic power which fosters and promotes it. There is great caution not to allow restorative justice to be used or co-opted by the legal system. The formal restorative justice is intimately connected to the judiciary due to the fact that its introduction happened thanks to the program of the judiciary system and the United Nations Development Program in 2005, which promoted 3 pilot projects. See this. Here we have the map of Brazil and 3 small red hearts, one in Brasília, another in São Paulo, and another in Rio Grande do Sul, showing the beginning in 2005. See, in Brasília, the heart in the middle, where they worked on special criminal courts, which are cases with minor offenses involving adult offenders. In Rio Grande do Sul, the heart at the bottom of the map, the program focused on juvenile delinquency. In Brazil, minors are people under 18. They don't respond for crimes, but for infraction acts. And finally, in São Paulo, where they also worked with young people, but focused on the implementation of restorative justice in schools of the public system. At first, this intervention in schools was intended for the students, thinking about ways of solving, treating conflicts between them, the students. See, let me change the slide. In this slide, you can see 2005, the beginning, 2016. From 2005 to 2016, a lot of projects were developed. A lot of knowledge was built, and the need of a rule was becoming clear. A rule. And I could list 2 reasons. To support judges who want to work with restorative justice. It's not the ordinary activity of a judge, as you know. And to ensure that what we call the restorative justice was really connected with restorative principle and values. The resolution brought very significant concepts, as you can see. According to Resolution 225 from 2016, Article 1, restorative justice constitutes itself in an order and systemic set of principles, its own methods, techniques, and activities, which aims to raise awareness of the relational, institutional, and social factors that motivate conflicts and violence. I would like to highlight 2 points in this article. So, it's a set of principles and practice. Not only principles, it can be only theory, and not only practice either. The practice materializes the restorative justice theory. For example, the peacemaking circle, which is known as an restorative justice practice. I can have all the rituals, but if it's not connected with the principle of RJ, it won't be a restorative justice practice. And it's important to say that and to be written. And second, the 3 dimensions of the conflict: relational, institutional, and social. See, I will show on the next slide. I'm trying to, yes. This is the judge Egberto Penito, one of the judges who started this history. Egberto usually says, these 3 dimensions were built in this work together with the schools. So I will explain these 3 dimensions considering the developing in the schools. See, next slide. The first moment, they were looking at conflicts between students. It's very interesting here to call your attention to the importance of learning from mistakes. Egberto participated in the first project in schools, and he shared with us it was a learning process. Initially, they arrived at schools acting and feeling like judges. White men who seemed to have the solution for all the problems. As he generally says, we couldn't be more mistaken. They learned a lot and could realize that they were there to walk together, each of them with their own experience, adding up efforts in a collective constructions, not only to address questions related to students, but also to all the issues regarding relationships inside school. In other words, students, teachers, managers in school and outside of them walking all together in the direction of a restorative school, necessarily going through the relational, institutional, and social dimension. See. Relational dimension. Here, we need to work on our internal relationship, me with myself, and interpersonal relationship through a dialogic approach. There is the possibility of getting to know the human being as a holistic being, not only a mental one, but also an emotion, a physical, spiritual one. It is possible to understand their needs, their goals. But it's not enough. You need to go to the institutional dimension. Also, the relationships between managers, teachers, employees need of attention. See, soon became clear that there was a need to work on the existing hierarchical relationships at schools. Schools and courts are, in general, hierarchical structures. The hierarchy can bring violence that sometimes we are not able to see, but they are there, tensioning the relationships, and they need to be carried for. See, I bring the part of a poem from Bertolt Brecht. The rushing river they call violent, but the riverbed pressing it in, nobody calls violent. Egberto, the judge that I mentioned, wrote an article and cited this part of the poem to talk about the institutional dimension. And now I would like to bring about the social dimension. The school is strongly connected with the life outside it. So it was necessary to create connections out of school to support the RJ philosophy. This need to go beyond the limits of the school became very clear. So support was sought from UNAS, in the example of Heliópolis that I will tell. UNAS, a non-governmental organization that became a great partner, starting to work and promote the rationality of RJ. And this is exactly our goal, that partners take ownership of restorative justice rationality. It's important to have the partners operating in the same rationality. See, the next slide, I show the structure of that was developed inside the Heliopolis project. You can see the basic structure is the school, the community, represented by UNAS, and the judiciary. Monthly, they have meetings to think about how to lead the next steps. Other partners that have already been part of the project or are still part of it are Guardianship Council, Municipal Health, Social Assistance, Public Defense. See, this idea of these three dimensions, it's not only to restorative justice in education, but for all restorative justice projects, okay? Now I will show Heliopolis. Heliopolis, here you can see in the map, it's the highlight of state of São Paulo in the blue, and the location of the city of São Paulo in the red heart. As well, a photo of Heliopolis favela. It's the second biggest favela in São Paulo state in number of people, with more than 55,000 inhabitants. This project in Heliopolis started in 2006, created strong roots, and is still there today. See, this photo is, in this photo, you can see UNAS, the non-governmental organization that became a partner, promoting the rationality of restorative justice inside the favela, inside the slum too. Here we can see Solange. Solange, she lives inside the favela, and she was a guardianship counselor when the project started in 2006. She's a very important reference for all this work. She has in her hands the magazine that they published, Peace is the Way, presenting outcomes of part of this path. And now, in this slide, we can see two pictures where there are young boys and girls that had taken the course to become facilitators. And they were sharing impressions about the project that they developed about racism in schools. In this other slide, this was a moment of celebration at the end of year 2023. We can see in the highlight picture Egberto and Solange with other community members. And now in this other one, the community radio. This community radio is inside the favela. And they use all this structure for restorative justice. See, here you see the numbers for peace. That a page up from the magazine Peace is the Way, which shows the numbers of the last 2 years. 1,210 circles in 3 cities, São Paulo, São Bernardo, and São Caetano. Heliopolis is in the border of São Paulo with São Caetano and São Bernardo cities. And you can see here in the yellow, 700 young people impacted. In the green, 45 young people capacitated in the circle process as facilitator. And in the last one, 165 professionals, teachers, principals, health and social assistant professionals were qualified as facilitator. In this next slide, we can see the CNJ committee members visiting Heliopolis, and in this small picture, wearing red, the circle process instructor, Sabrina Paroli. It's important to say her name because she is there since 2007. Here, now I'm going to show another project. We can see pictures of the first project in which CNJ got involved directly. It's near Brasilia, in a place called Planaltina. We can see Judge Marcelo Salmazo facilitate a circle with students, and beside it, a circle with students' parents, since the beginning. In this next slide, I'm facilitating a circle with young people with disabilities. And something that I'd like to share. Before the circle, I had explained about the principle and the values of restorative justice. And I asked them about a value that was important for them. One of them told me, love. It was very special. And see in this next slide, in 2022, we have another resolution, Resolution 458. It was edicted and included RJ in education in Resolution 225. And here, I bring a provocation with a lesson, we could say from Paulo Freire. And what's the role of restorative justice in education? To foster a creative process of learning the other and freedom, or banking system of education? The process of conditioning the mind and preparing young people for the market's needs only, not CeSGReM, as I learned from my professor, João Sal. And continuing, before talking about this research, we have done an overview of restorative justice in Brazil. We saw the role of CNJ, Resolution 225, the basis of the work, and a very significant work in RJ in education. Now I will bring some general registers about its development. So we can see an empirical research on the development of restorative justice from the judiciary. The name of the research is Piloting the Restorative Justice. So in 2017, this empirical research was done, and it shows that from 2005, from 2010, the first period, RJ in Brazil was very connected with those three pilot projects. The second period, from 2010 to 2017, when the research was done, they could register a very intense growth of restorative justice. And now, I would risk to say that after 2018, it accelerated and became even stronger. Today, all the state courts, 27, and the federal court, 6, are developing programs and projects. See, from the research, an interesting register from the research is that even though restorative justice in Brazil is influenced by Euro-American culture, we have been building a Brazilian restorative justice that has its own characteristics as an outcome from local realities. And now, in this researchers pointed out that some practice called restorative were found, but in fact, they weren't restorative. They were only a conciliation and were not connected with the principle and the values of restorative justice. And the research also highlighted the issue of practice formation and the lack of evaluation criteria. So it motivates a new movement. So, awareness of this concern about the quality of training, the committee collected information from all training entities in restorative practice and prepared a document with minimum rules to be observed, the minimum guiding pedagogical plan. And it's important today to work with judiciary. All the formations, facilitated formations, need to be present and not online. Now, I would like to, in the outcome, we have good experience receiving diverse cases from the criminal system, in family cases, environment issues, in prisons, a lot of other subjects. In fact, restorative justice is becoming more and more mature, more and more mature, day after day, and advancing in different contexts, like in the work inside the courts, looking for the opportunity to take care of communities of the judiciary system, creating a preventive work to promote good relationships as a way to strengthen the internal community. And if disciplinary infractions as well harassment cases take place, they can be addressed by restorative justice process, depending on the circumstances. See, a different movement that's gaining strength with the goal of making these institutions a better place to work in and promotes a sense of co-responsibility. Today, we have a rule that provides for the possibility of sending, redirect, a case when a judge is being accused of a fault to be treated by restorative justice. And why it's so important? To promote awareness and responsibility. And moving toward the end of my presentation, I would like to talk about a possibility of consensus in the criminal legal system that has been used as an opportunity to redirect cases to the restorative justice system. It is called non-criminal prosecution agreement, which is a tool of the legal system that allows agreement for crimes whose minimum penalty is under 4 years and with no violence or strong threat. Now, I brought the audio from a person who went through a restorative justice process using this opportunity of non-criminal prosecution agreement. This man, after the process got to the end, by his own initiative, sent a sequence of WhatsApp messages talking about the impact of it in his life. I would like to invite you to listen to one of these messages that he authorized us to show. Let me see.
Ô, Carla,
Can you hear?
eu tava vendo um vídeo, aí tipo, um menino que ele era de boa, aí a família dele aceitava ele, que ser enfermeiro, aí ele foi roubar, sabe? Aí um dia lá na entrevista, a polícia, assim, sabe? No jornal Revista lá do Nordeste, ele falou que ele tinha um sonho, que era ser enfermeiro, mas Deus ia mudar a vida dele. Assim, que ele não era assim, que ele tinha um sonho, ele tinha uma vida, mas Deus ia mudar. Então, tipo assim, ó, tipo, naquele dia lá que você falou pra mim, você mais André, tipo, se vocês me deram uma chance de vida, porque pela justiça, pela nossa lei do Brasil hoje, eu não tinha nenhuma chance. Eu só tinha que aceitar o acordo que eu tinha. Mas vocês mostraram para mim outra forma. Danilo, pensa diferente. Olha o que você pode fazer pelos outros. E, tipo, eu hoje, Danilo Santos Campos, cara, através de vocês, eu sou bem melhor, velho. Tipo assim, vocês mudou minha vida. O meu modo de pensar, o meu modo de agir, velho. Hoje em dia, eu quero dar exemplo. Não que eu fui errado antes, mas eu quero dar exemplo hoje também. Eu quero mostrar que nós pode ser mais foda. Eu posso ajudar a gente sem nem saber de nada. Eu posso ajudar. Eu posso ajudar a pessoa sem nem eu conhecer. Mas sabe o que é isso, velho? Isso aí foi coisa que vocês trouxeram pra minha vida. Sabe, você, Carla, Andréia, Larissa, a outra moça, foi no primeiro dia, eu esqueço o nome dela sempre, né? Gente, isso daí, eu quero falar pro juiz. Eu quero falar um dia pra ele, velho. Eu quero ter a chance um dia de falar assim, sei lá, chamar de vídeo, qualquer coisa. E marcar o audiência, eu vou falar pra ele. Gente, vocês estão com as mulheres mais foda perto de vocês, velho. As mulheres, velho. A minha mãe comigo hoje, depois disso tudo ver, o trabalho que a gente fez. A minha irmã é uma nova mulher, velho, através de vocês. O meu pai é mais comigo, eu sou mais com meu pai. Aproximou a minha família toda. Sabe o que é isso? Hoje em dia eu sentou na mesa, hoje eu, meu pai e minha mãe, hoje, e nós conversamos como ser humanos, tipo assim, sabe? A gente olhou um dentro do outro, tipo, velho, e eles não se falavam. Sabe o que é isso? Através de vocês, velho. Olha, vocês traz vida. Velho, vocês traz vida, velho. Vocês traz vida para as pessoas. Vocês não traz julgamento, vocês traz vida. Vocês traz chance de vida para qualquer ser humano, velho. O coração de vocês, o trabalho de vocês.
We could listen.
Yes.
We could listen.
Could you
Could you
summarize the
listen?
story for the students? Because I suppose I didn't understand very well, and if you could summarize, it could be useful.
Sorry, Grace, I couldn't hear all that you said. The first about the education or about the audio?
About the audio.
The audio. So he says that it was a night, and he sends a lot of messages, WhatsApp messages to the facilitator, and he was telling her how it impacted his life and his family life, because their family, his mother and his father, they didn't talk. They couldn't see each other. And after all the process, in that night, they sit together and they could talk. That her mother, her sister, is another woman now. And all in the community, they could see how he was different. They could see all that they have done and how it impacted their lives. This is the idea. Today, it has, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Today, he's working, he's married, he's a father, he's working his job, and their lives changed completely. Her sister asked us to do the course to be a facilitator. And it was very impacting. The one of the things that they decided to do in the agreement, they send they gifts to children who doesn't have anything, but they asked for any children what they wanted to receive. And when they went there, it was a Christmas. When they went there, they were very, I don't know the best way to say, João, help me, that they were muito aplaudidos. Open the
Please. He had a standing ovation. People clapped.
Yes.
Okay.
And for him, it was very, very important. It was a mark. It was that day and after, how community could see him. And it's why I would to share with you this audio. Make sense?
Yes, definitively. Thank you so much.
Is that it's what we have been done, and I love to share with you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katia, for this touching presentation. João, have you any consideration or?
Yeah. Obrigado, Katia. Katia, during your presentation, you gave us a broader understanding of how historically restorative justice has been implemented in Brazil.
Mhm.
And how the judiciary, through the Brazilian National Council, which is an administrative branch of the Brazilian Supreme Court, has led nationwide the implementation process of restorative justice. There is a Brazilian sociologist, anthropologist, philosopher by the name of Darcy Ribeiro. And Darcy Ribeiro wrote a book called The Brazilian People. It's a must-read to understand the complexity of Brazil. Brazil is not for amateurs. And the basic thought in that book says that Brazil is a country that was built and constructed by 3 main people. The Europeans who came and colonized Brazil, mainly Italians, Germans in the south, in São Paulo, and obviously the Portuguese, right? The Dutch and others. Also the African descent who were brought in as slaves to work in diverse number of productions in Brazil, but also the indigenous population, the diverse number of Brazilian of indigenous populations of Brazil. My question to you is, how much of these populations, mainly the indigenous first people of Brazil and the African descent, how much of their knowledge and their experiences and their own ideas of justice has been considered by the Brazilian National Council as important and inclusive knowledge to the implementation of restorative justice since its inception. It sounds to me that I've been a bit of a troublemaker when it comes to this, because I feel that we should honor that knowledge that pre-existed to 2005 and say that that indigenous knowledge was there. And furthermore, the knowledge of you presented Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire had this common pedagogical process called cultural circles. How much of that authentic Brazilian knowledge it was considered in the elaboration of restorative justice in Brazil throughout now over a decade? That's one question. The second question is,
may I answer this first?
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
I am your student, or I was your student. So I know what you think, and I know the problems that you have. We like the restorative justice movement in Brazil is a movement that starts formally with judges, white people. And we have this problem. I think in the same way in the US, I'm reading a lot from colorizing restorative justice. We have the same problem here. And we were trying to work to change it. But we have 20 years in this construction. And I think today people are thinking about it, are trying to do something to not reproduce this violence of excluding these people, could say African descendants and indigenous population too. Because indigenous population are the really own of this land. And why we went to learn a different practice from Canada and from the North America, if we have a lot of indigenous groups with a lot of different practice? It's something that we have to think. We know that. But when I learn peacemaking circles. Can you understand? And things were made in this way. I don't know if people have this idea when this movement started. But it's something that we have to think. And it include African descendants. It's very, very important because we have a rude deal with these people. All the process of the slave, it's something that one day they said, no, you are not more a slave. Okay, you don't have anything. You don't have a work. You don't have a house. You don't have nothing. So they continue being slaves and not having opportunities for study, for housing, for a lot of things. It's something that restorative justice can't say it's not my problem. It's our problem.
Yeah, but I still feel that there is a resistance by the Brazilian judiciary because it still insists in bringing these outside gurus, such as K. Pranis, to inculcate a certain form of RJ practice when we could bring in this
It's not a movement.
diversity, and it's not being done. There is a resistance there, and I would like to know why. Why does the Brazilian National Council still support this sociological reductionism, where you're bringing a model from outside when there is this really rich knowledge, indigenous knowledge, Afro descent knowledge, to sort of co-create something that is not an extension of the state form of judiciary, but it is something that is co-created and may perhaps become the law, not not an extension,
Well,
but something that
I,
is
I think
authentic. And it baffles me because there is a movement now, and I've been very critical of this, and I've been getting a lot of heat, but there is a movement now where in Africa and Latin America, we have forums such as the Latin American Forum of Restorative Justice, the African. I mean, that is troubling to me because it sounds a lot like sociological reductionism, where we are being colonized again through the mindset of a colonial mindset, where this incredible knowledge that we have at our, that I don't think, I think it's important to acknowledge the land in which indigenous people come from. I think that's important, but I also think it would be extremely valid and legitimate if we were able to invite this to co-create knowledge, and in the sense that you are not only saying, okay, this is your land, we have to honor that, but you have a knowledge that should be
Mhm.
something that we need to consider in constructing this RJ as the law of the land. And I don't see that happening in Brazil. I think there is a strong resistance. We still feel that we need the outside, guru kind of.
May I, João?
Yeah,
May
for
I?
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you had to share to split what is CNJ, what's out of CNJ.
Mhm.
You must have it clear. What we can do inside the judiciary system for the courts to promoting good good courses. You can stimulate some ideas. We can do the courses, the rules, but we can change everybody's mind. And exactly there are people who want to do this. We have we know that there are a lot of interests involved, and it's not about a restorative CNJ committee or CNJ. It's our society and how they are offering this product. See, you understand what I'm speaking.
Yeah, it's
We
just
can
this.
stimulate, and you are an important person who had developed a very important event here in Campo Grande, bringing a lot of indigenous people to speak, because we need to give voice to indigenous people, not to say, no, we respect. No, we need to give voice. And you have done an important event for this. And I think CNJ must stimulate it, promoting a lot of events for this. but we are trying.
Mm. Okay.
Thank you very much. George, I don't know if you want to add something. From my side, I would like to make an observation, and I was surprised to see judges facilitating circles. It's very interesting, and it shows that even in the judiciary, restorative justice may be an approach. I don't know if you were facilitated cases related to criminal matters or not. But from the Italian perspective, it's very unusual. Judges are not allowed to facilitate cases in Italy because there is a strong separation between mediators and facilitators, the judiciary and the lawyers. But it's even more interesting because a sort of dialogue is possible, and I'm quite sure that state law covers a reality which is much more complex, where there are lots of voices, even inside a country, which could be seen as an homogeneous countries like Italy, for example. And I also think that the cultural change is very hard to promote, because if I observe the Italian situation, now we have a very good legislation with some shadows, of course, but in any case, a good legislation. But I feel that lawyers are totally against restorative justice. Judges are rather skeptical. We had even the pronounce of the Supreme Court of Cassation, which is based on a wrong interpretation of the Italian legislation. And the community doesn't understand the spirit of restorative justice, and there is a sort of overlap between restorative justice and pardon and forgiveness. So it's very hard to promote this cultural change, this cultural improvement, because we should think, as Professor Pavlich said, justice in a plural way. So we don't have any more lady justice blindfolded with the sword and the scale, but now we have justices maybe that can coexist in the same country. George, would you like to add something, or I don't know?
Yeah. I just want to say thank you very much, Katia. I really appreciated that talk, and think that bringing in some of those Judge Egberto's word, the quote was fantastic. And I think also, Paulo Freire is significant here. In as much as when I look at what you're talking about, when I looked at that Heliopolis circle, I couldn't help but think, why is that not law? Why is it? Because it's affecting more people than the abstract judicial. And I think it's really interesting that the judiciary, so my point would be that they're plural legal fields, and that you really have, it's not like state laws out there and it's going to go. No, it's not. But the point is that you can articulate and have interactions between legal fields, so long as the legal fields don't lose what it is that makes them distinctive. And I think that circle was, for me, quite an interesting one. So that's all I would like to add. I just thought really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to explain, I cannot facilitate a case that you judge after. It's something important, but I'm facilitating cases, including not cases, but I'm facilitating circles to work the ambience, the institutional ambience inside CNJ. And I think it's very, very important for people who work there. I can see the outcomes. So we can do it. I think it's too small yet, this movement, but it needs to grow and become stronger and stronger. It's necessary. And thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Katia. Thank you, Professor Pavlich. I think it's time to conclude this lecture devoted to the Americas. And I think that we all have lots of issues to reflect on. Thank you for your insights, for your thoughtful, thought-provoking presentations, and for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, your expertise about restorative justice. João, I'm so happy that you are here. It's really like a dream.
Yeah.
And so once again, thank you so much. And as I told you to the previous guests, you will be invited to become honorary members of the Restorative Justice Study Center, and you will receive a formal invitation later on. So once again, thanks. I wish you a wonderful evening, and I thank you all the participants online to this event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.